From finance too.
Well, I'd like to preface my introduction of this panel by noting that many Canadians have heard that the U.S. Environment Protection Agency, the U.S. EPA, is conducting public hearings into hydraulic fracturing as background to possible amendments to the U.S. Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Many Canadians believe that Environment Canada, or Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, will play a similar role in this country. Hence, both federal departments were invited onto this panel to comment on their role, if any, on this topic. Environment Canada declined, and Natural Resources Canada sent a note to say, unequivocally, that it has no statutory authority when it comes to shale gas development and drinking water protection, and that this authority rests with the provinces. Representatives of the Ontario government provided their positions in the preparation of today's research. The provinces of Quebec and British Columbia, where shale gas development is well underway, were invited and declined.
And why are the Canadian government regulators not here? I think this is an absolute scandal. And I hope they hear about this. If you're watching, be warned. We're here.
In the meantime, with us today are regulators from 2 American states, Colorado and New York, where extensive hydraulic fracturing is underway or proposed. I'm going to start with Val Washington. Val Washington is an environmental lawyer currently serving as Deputy Commissioner for Remediation and Materials Management in the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, sometimes known as the DEC. Prior to her current post, she has held a number of government and non-government positions in the field of environmental protection and has taught environmental courses as an adjunct professor at several colleges and universities. She served for 13 years under New York Attorney General Robert Abrams as Deputy Chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau. Following her career as the Assistant Attorney General, she was named Executive Director of Environmental Advocates of New York, the state's leading environmental advocacy organization. After more than a decade of work in the nonprofit sector, she returned to state government in May of 2007 to accept her current appointment. She oversees the DEC's divisions of solid and hazardous materials, environmental remediation, and mineral resources. Welcome, Val.
I was brought in because of my history of work on environmental remediation issues, brownfield, Superfund, and so forth. And I got a call just before I started asking if I would be willing to also take on the Mineral and Oil and Gas Bureau. And I was told by the commissioner that handled this previously that it's just this quiet little bureau. We'll never hear anything from them. That hasn't been true. Well, we do have a long history in New York of oil and gas development, as Ben laid out in his paper. Been doing it for over 150 years. We have right now about 14,000 operating oil and gas wells, mainly in western New York. One of the reasons I believe that the Marcellus Shale is so controversial in New York, it's going to be in a part of the state where they have very little experience with and great fear of drilling. In addition to a regulatory regime, we have a statute that lays out the parameters of our oil and gas program, and then we have regulations. Both give very, very broad authority to the Department of Environmental Conservation to regulate oil and gas drilling and to protect the environment in doing so. And this is mainly is administered through permit conditions. When people come in and apply for a permit, there's a has been in modern times, since fairly rigorous regulatory regime. We do inspections prior to drilling to look at the site, we do a site assessment, we try to be there when they're doing the cementing and casing and initial drilling, of course, and then afterwards we have a statute that requires remediation of the site within a few months. And we take a bond to assure that will happen. But there's another layer of environmental assessment in New York under the State Environmental Quality Review Act, SEQR, which is New York's so-called Little NEPA, if you're familiar with the federal government's NEPA law, where you look at the environmental impacts of, it's usually something that the government either finances or permits. There was a generic environmental impact assessment done of the drilling industry in New York back in 1992. And it's generic and meant to apply to the vast majority of operations under this program. And in that statement, and the goal is to assess what the environmental impacts are and to mitigate the significant impacts. Again, this was done for the industry and in 1992, and the potential impacts, the list is not going to be surprising. It's surface waters, siltation and turbidity, groundwater, agriculture, historic sites, and so forth. And in the end, the findings were, if drilling operation was going to meet these generic parameters and if they followed the mitigation requirements, there would be no significant impact. And no further environmental review would be needed for site-specific drilling approvals. And as part of the mitigation, there are very strict required casing and cementing practices. This has not been true in other states, and I try not to be critical of what other states have done, because every state has its own culture, as Jan pointed out, its own politics and their own history. But I was interested in the first major violations in Dimmock, Pennsylvania. One of the requirements for Cabot, the company that was responsible for these violations, one of the requirements under the consent order was they would have to come in and give a drilling and casing plan, provide logs, and a demonstration. These logs are mechanical and electronic, with a full opportunity for review by the state. This has always been required in New York of everybody in the modern age, since the 80s. So I feel like we've had good regulation in New York. We have a good history. Again, somebody compared earlier to other industries. We have a very good history when you compare drilling to other industries. It's amazing how many people didn't even know there was such a thing as oil and gas drilling in New York. But the impact statement in 1992 also pointed to situations that would require additional environmental assessment. For example, if there was going to be disturbance of more than 2.5 acres of farmland, if it was going to be within a certain distance of a water supply. And there's a list of these situations that would require a site-specific environmental impact statement. This has actually functioned as really a ban on those practices, because we have found that the drilling companies were unwilling to take on the cost and the time that it would take to do a full-blown environmental impact statement for a single site. So essentially what we've seen in New York is the environmental impact statement acting as a regulation and prohibition on certain practices.